Edward Crawford stood at the panoramic window of his penthouse on the 72nd floor, looking out over Chicago. The city sparkled with lights, Michigan Avenue, the skyscrapers, the river, but up here, in his world of glass and steel, there was silence. He liked it that way. Power, order, control. At 47, he had built an empire of hotels where every detail, from the chandeliers in the lobbies to the staff uniforms, was subject to his will. Edward didn't believe in fate or coincidences. He believed in the power of decisions, in his ability to hold the world in his fist. His reflection in the glass was impeccable. Tall, fit, dressed in a $5,000 Tom Ford suit with dark hair touched with gray at the temples. He adjusted his gold cufflinks engraved with EC and turned to pick up his tablet with reports. Dinner alone, bourbon, work. That was his evening ritual. He didn't trust others, and not even himself, but that he buried deep beneath a layer of cold confidence. The living room door opened silently, and Lillian Marsh entered. For 2 years, she had been his maid, a quiet part of the household machinery. 32 years old, with hair the color of dark honey pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes always downcast. Her uniform, black dress, white apron, was pressed to a crisp, her movements precise, almost mechanical. She carried a tray, ribeye steak, truffle oil potatoes, water with a slice of lemon. He'd pour his own bourbon. "Good evening, Mr. Crawford." Her voice was even, empty, devoid of any emotion. "Thank you, Lillian," he replied, not lifting his eyes from the screen. She set the tray on the table and turned to leave. That's when everything changed. Her elbow brushed against a vase, Murano glass, $1,000, and it crashed to the marble floor. The sound of shattering glass split the silence like a gunshot. Lillian froze, her back tensing. Edward looked up. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, not turning around. There was a faint tremble in her voice, subtle but noticeable. "I'll clean it up now." She knelt, gathering the shards into her apron. He stood and approached. For the first time, he saw her face fully, pale, with delicate features, a small wrinkle of tension between her brows. Her hands, in thin gloves, trembled, though she tried to hide it. And then, something sharp and hot tightened in Edward's chest. Not irritation, not pity. Desire. Sudden, like an electric shock. Their eyes met. Hers, gray-green, deep like Lake Michigan in a storm, were filled with worry. She quickly looked away. "Leave it," he said, his voice hoarse, surprising even himself. "I'll call someone from housekeeping." "No, sir. It's my mistake. I need to fix it." Her voice grew firmer, almost sharp, with a hint of stubbornness. He watched as she collected the pieces, feeling his control slipping, not over the house, not over his empire, but over himself. Lillian Marsh, a shadow in his life, had suddenly become visible, alive, real, and he couldn't look away. The following days turned into a strange kaleidoscope for Edward. He found himself listening for the sound of her footsteps on the marble, waiting for the clatter of her cleaning cart, stealing glances at her from the crack of his office door. It was absurd, almost humiliating. He, a man who could buy half the world, was now at the mercy of some vague, inexplicable attraction. Lillian remained the same, cold, detached, flawless in her work. She didn't notice his stares, or pretended not to. Her professionalism was like a wall, and he, used to breaking down any barrier, didn't know how to approach this one. He started looking for excuses to get closer. One evening, he called her to the library under the pretense of rearranging books on the top shelves, a task he could have delegated to any of his dozen employees. Lillian entered with a small ladder, nodded silently, and got to work. Edward sat in a leather chair with a glass of bourbon, pretending to read, but his eyes followed her every move. Her figure, hidden by the uniform, was slender but not fragile. There was strength in her, forged by hard work. When she reached for a high shelf, her sleeve slid up, revealing a thin scar on her wrist, a white line on her pale skin. Edward leaned forward. "Where's that from?" he asked, pointing to the scar. She froze, lowered her arm, and quickly pulled the sleeve down. "An old injury, sir. Nothing important." Her voice was dry, detached, as always. "Everything in this house matters, Lillian," he said, his voice lower, softer than he intended. "Even you." She turned to him, and for a moment, something flashed in her eyes. Surprise? Caution? But it vanished just as quickly. "I'm here to do my job, Mr. Crawford. Nothing more." Her words hit like a cold, precise blow. Edward leaned back in his chair, feeling a fire ignite in his chest. She was right, of course. But that didn't change what he felt. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to do with it. Lillian Marsh wasn't blind. She'd noticed the change in him that night with the vase. His stares, his voice, his sudden questions. It was like a crack in the familiar order of her world. She didn't want this. Her life was built with surgical precision. Work, home, savings for the future. She'd grown up in a poor neighborhood on Chicago's South Side, where every dollar had to be fought for. Now, working for Edward Crawford, she earned more than her mother had in a lifetime, and that gave her freedom, real freedom, not dependent on someone else's charity. She harbored no illusions about men like him. She'd seen them before, rich, powerful, used to taking whatever they wanted. Her independence was her armor, and she wasn't about to shed it for a billionaire's fleeting whim. But deep down, she felt a twinge of fear, not of him, but of herself. Because, despite all her restraint, she couldn't help but notice him. His strength, his loneliness, his vulnerability, which he so carefully hid. And that scared her more than anything. Every evening, back in her small apartment in Logan Square, she stood at the window and looked at the city lights. Her thoughts returned to him, his eyes, which seemed to see more than she wanted to show. Lillian clenched her fists and reminded herself, this wasn't her world. She was the maid, he was the magnate. Between them lay a chasm that couldn't be crossed. Yet, as she fell asleep, she felt her armor beginning to crack. Edward searched for new ways. The next day, he accidentally spilled coffee on the living room carpet, a dark stain spreading across the light fibers. "Lillian, clean this up," he said, watching her from a chair. She entered, nodded, and got to work. He stood and approached, closer than necessary. Her movements were precise, but he noticed her lips pressed together, a subtle sign of tension. He stepped even closer. "Are you always this calm?" he asked, lowering his voice to an almost intimate tone. She straightened, looked at him, directly, without a trace of fear. "It's my job, sir. Calmness is part of it." "And what's beneath it?" He leaned in, his breath almost touching her face. "What are you hiding?" Her eyes narrowed, a flash of steel in them. "Nothing you need to know." She stepped back, holding the cloth like a shield. "If that's all, I'm done." She left, leaving him in silence. Edward clenched his fist, feeling a fire raging in his chest. He wanted to break her, to uncover what lay behind that wall. But the harder he pushed, the more he realized she wouldn't yield, and that only fueled his desire. Lillian locked herself in her small staff room in the penthouse, a narrow bed, a closet, a desk. Her heart pounded. His words, his closeness, it was too much. She leaned against the wall, closed her eyes, and tried to steady her breathing. She needed to leave, find another job, escape this. But the money, and something else. something she didn't want to name. She opened a drawer and pulled out an old photo. Her mother, her younger brother. Her family depended on her. Her mother was sick, her brother was in college, and all their hopes rested on her salary. It reminded her of who she was and why she was here. Feelings were a luxury she couldn't afford. Edward Crawford was dangerous not because of his power, but because of what he awakened in her, and she had to suppress it. The next day, she decided to end it. She entered his office, holding a tray with coffee, his morning order, standing straight, resolute. "Mr. Crawford," she said, setting the cup on the table, "I'm asking you to stop." He looked up from his papers, his gaze sharp, piercing. "Stop what?" he asked, a hint of mockery in his tone, as if he already knew the answer. "You know," her voice wavered, but she forced herself to continue. "This is interfering with my work, and my life." He stood, walked around the desk, and approached her. Too close. She felt the heat of his body, the scent of his cologne, sharp, with notes of leather and wood. "And what if I don't want to?" he asked quietly, almost in a whisper, looking into her eyes. She stepped back to the door, her hand on the handle. "Then I'll leave, and that will be your choice," she said, and walked out, leaving him in silence. Edward stared at the closed door, feeling something inside him break. Her words were an ultimatum, and he could lose her. For the first time, that scared him. He returned to the desk, picked up the coffee cup, but didn't drink, just held it, letting the porcelain warm his hands. He could fire her, cut this off at the root. But the thought of that left him empty in a way he couldn't explain. He wanted her near, not as a maid, but as... he didn't know what. It was madness, but he couldn't stop. The next evening, he found another excuse. In the dining room, he dropped a glass of wine, the red stain spreading across the white carpet like blood. "Lillian," he called, his voice low, almost intimate. She came, silently began cleaning. He stood nearby, watching. Her hands moved quickly, but he noticed her jaw tighten, another sign of tension. He leaned in, pretending to help, and their fingers nearly touched. She yanked her hand back as if burned. "I can handle it, sir," she said sharply. "I don't doubt it," he replied, looking into her eyes. "But I like watching." She froze, then stood, holding the cloth. "That's inappropriate, Mr. Crawford." Her voice was icy, but there was a faint tremor in it. "Maybe." He straightened, not breaking eye contact. "But it's true." She left without another word. Edward remained alone, feeling the fire in his chest grow. He'd crossed a line, and he liked it. Lillian locked herself in her room, shaking. His words, his closeness, it was like poison seeping into her blood. She hated herself for what she felt. The heat in her chest when he looked at her. The weakness when he spoke. She couldn't allow this. Sitting at her small desk, she opened her laptop and started searching for jobs. Maid, cleaner, anything. Leaving was the only way out. But every time she reached for the submit button on a resume, her fingers froze. The money, her family, and him. She stood, walked to the window, and looked at the city. Chicago's lights twinkled like stars, but her thoughts were elsewhere. She remembered the first time she saw Edward, cold, untouchable, like a statue. Back then, he was just her employer. Now, he was a threat, and a temptation. She hated him for it, and herself for not being able to leave. 2 days later, the tension reached its peak. Edward called her to his office late at night, a rarity since her shift usually ended at 7. He sat at his desk, papers spread out, but his gaze was distant. "Lillian," he said when she entered, "I need you to organize the files in the cabinet. Urgently." She nodded, approached the cabinet, and began working. He watched her, openly. Her movements were precise, but he noticed her hands tremble slightly as she pulled out a folder. He stood and approached, standing behind her. "You're tense," he said quietly, almost touching her shoulder. She froze, not turning around. "I'm fine, sir." "No." He placed a hand on the cabinet next to her, blocking her escape. "You're avoiding me. Why?" She turned, trapped between him and the cabinet. Her eyes met his, a mix of anger and fear. "Because you're crossing lines," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'm not a toy, Mr. Crawford." He leaned closer, their faces inches apart. "I know," he whispered, "and that scares me." She pushed him away, not hard, but decisively, and left, leaving the folders on the floor. Edward watched her go, his heart pounding in his throat. He'd gone too far, and he couldn't stop. Lillian ran down the hall until she reached her room. She closed the door and leaned against it, breathless. His words, "It scares me," echoed in her mind. He was vulnerable, like her, and that made it worse. She clenched her fists, fighting herself. She needed to leave, tomorrow. She'd write her resignation and be gone. But that night, she couldn't sleep. Lying awake, staring at the ceiling, she thought of his eyes, his voice, his closeness. She hated herself for it, and knew her decision wouldn't be easy. Edward stood at the office window, looking at the city. He'd lost control. For the first time, he didn't know what to do. Fire her, force her to stay. He wanted her, not as a trophy, but as a person. And that scared him most of all. Lillian woke with a heavy feeling in her chest. The night had brought no peace, only confusion and exhaustion. She lay in her small room in the penthouse, staring at the gray ceiling, trying to pull herself together. The decision was made. Today, she'd submit her resignation. It was the only way to escape the web Edward Crawford had spun around her. Willingly or not, she didn't know. His stares, his words, his closeness had become unbearable. But worse was her own response, the warmth in her chest, the tremble in her hands when he was near. She got up, splashed cold water on her face, feeling the drops trickle down her neck, and put on her uniform with mechanical precision. The mirror reflected her face, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, but determined. Lillian Marsh didn't give up. She'd survived a poverty-stricken childhood, her father's death, her mother's illness. Edward Crawford, with all his power and wealth, wouldn't break her. She reminded herself why she worked here, for her family, for her freedom. Her feelings for him, if you could call them that, threatened everything she'd built. Folding her resignation, short, dry, professional. "I request to be relieved of my duties, effective April 18th, 2025, Lillian Marsh." She slipped it into her apron pocket and stepped into the hall. The penthouse was quiet, as it always was in the mornings. Edward usually rose early, but stayed in his office until noon. Her shift started with cleaning the kitchen, and she headed there, head held high. Today, it would end. Edward hadn't slept all night. After last night in the office, her sharp exit, her words, "I'm not a toy," he'd been alone, staring at the scattered folders. Her defiance only intensified his obsession. He hated himself for it. He was used to controlling everything: business, people, emotions. But Lillian was like a grain of sand in a machine, small but capable of breaking it. He stood at the window, drank bourbon straight from the bottle, and tried to understand what was happening to him. This wasn't just desire. It was deeper, more painful, almost like a need. In the morning, he showered, changed into a fresh suit, dark blue, sharp lines emphasizing his authority, and sat at his desk, but work wouldn't come. His thoughts kept returning to her eyes full of anger and fear, her voice trembling with tension. He'd crossed a line last night, and he knew it. But instead of backing off, he wanted to push further. That scared him. Edward Crawford feared nothing, not competitors, not failures, not loneliness. But Lillian made him feel vulnerable, and that was unbearable. He heard footsteps in the hall, light, familiar. Her. He stood, walked to the door, and cracked it open. Lillian was at the kitchen counter, wiping it with the same mechanical precision as always. But today, there was something different about her. Tension, resolve. Edward gripped the door handle. He couldn't pretend these were accidental encounters anymore. He wanted to see her, talk to her, break down that wall, and he knew it was selfish. "Lillian," he called, stepping into the kitchen. She froze, not turning around. "Good morning, sir," she replied, her voice even but cold. "We need to talk," he said, moving closer. She turned, gripping the cloth tightly. "If this is about last night, I already said everything I wanted to," she said. "No," he stopped a few steps away. "You said I'm crossing lines, and you're right, but I can't stop." Her eyes narrowed. "Then I'll do it for you." She pulled the folded paper from her pocket and handed it to him. "My resignation. 2 weeks, as required." Edward froze. Her words hit like a slap. He took the paper, but didn't unfold it. "Why?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "Because I can't work somewhere I'm not respected," she answered, meeting his gaze. "And because I don't want to," she trailed off, swallowing hard. "Don't want what?" He stepped closer, clutching the paper. "It doesn't matter," she stepped back. "This is my decision." He looked at her, feeling everything inside him collapse. She was leaving, and he couldn't stop her, not with force, not with power. For the first time, he realized his money and status meant nothing against her will. "Stay," he said quietly. "Please." She shook her head. "No, sir. This is the end." She left, leaving him with the paper in his hand. Edward unfolded it. "I request to be relieved of my duties, effective April 18th, 2025. Lillian Marsh." 2 lines, like a death sentence. Lillian returned to her room, closed the door, and leaned against it. Her hands shook. She'd done it. But instead of relief, she felt emptiness. His voice, "Stay, please," echoed in her mind, soft, almost broken. She hated him for it, and herself, for wanting to say yes. She sat on the bed, pulled out her phone, and opened a job search site. She needed to move on, but her fingers hesitated over the screen. The money, her family, and him. She stood, walked to the window, and looked at the city. Morning light flooded Chicago, but her world remained dark. She clenched her fists. She'd get through this. She always had. Edward couldn't focus. He sat in his office, staring at her resignation, drinking the coffee she'd brought that morning, for the last time. Her leaving was a blow to his world. He was used to losing people, partners, friends, lovers. But this was different. Lillian wasn't part of his empire. She was something more, something he couldn't name. He stood, walked to the cabinet, and grabbed the bourbon bottle. It was still morning, but he didn't care. He poured a full glass and downed it, feeling the burn in his throat. It didn't help. He wanted to go to her, say something, convince her to stay. But what could he offer? Money? She wasn't for sale. Love? He didn't even know what that was. All he had was power, and she rejected it. He remembered her eyes, gray-green, deep, full of strength and fear. Her voice, her scent, clean, with a faint hint of soap. Her hands, trembling as she gathered the vase shards. That was the moment it all began. And now, it was ending. He clenched his fist and slammed it on the desk, scattering pens and papers. Number. He wouldn't give up so easily. She was essential to him, not as a maid, as a person, and he'd find a way to keep her. He called his assistant, James, a lean man in his 40s who knew more about his affairs than anyone. James, Edward said when he entered, find out everything about Lillian Marsh, her family, debts, problems, everything. James nodded without asking questions. He was used to such requests. Edward leaned back, feeling a pang of guilt. This was an invasion. But he had to know what held her, what made her run. If he couldn't keep her with feelings, he'd find another way. Days passed, and the tension grew. Lillian worked with cold precision, avoiding Edward. He, on the other hand, sought her out, at every opportunity. A spilled tea in the living room, a request for documents, accidentally crossing paths in the hall when she was cleaning. She didn't react, clinging to her armor, but inside, it was cracking. His presence was like electricity, unseen, but palpable. One evening, he found her in the kitchen washing dishes. He stood by the counter, watching her, saying nothing. Lillian felt his gaze on the back of her neck, but didn't turn. "You can't make me stay," she said finally, not looking up from the sink. "I know," he replied quietly, "but I can ask." She turned off the water, dried her hands, and faced him. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling with suppressed anger. "What do you want from me?" He stepped closer, stopping a step away. "You," he said simply. "Not as a maid, as someone I can't forget." Her breath hitched. She stepped back, leaning against the counter. "That's impossible," she said. "You know who I am, and who you are." "I know," he leaned in closer, "and I don't care." She shook her head, her eyes glistening, with tears or anger, she wasn't sure. "And I do," she whispered, and left, leaving him alone. Edward watched her go, his heart pounding in his throat. Her words, "I do," were like a knife. She was right. He was the magnate. She was the maid. Between them wasn't just a gap, it was a chasm. But he couldn't let her go. For the first time, he'd met someone who didn't bend to his will, and it drove him crazy. He returned to his office, sat down, and opened her resignation. 2 weeks had shrunk to 10 days. He could tear it up, say he wouldn't accept it. But that would be a lie. She was leaving, and he wouldn't stop her. But he could try one more time. The next day, he called her to the living room. She entered, standing straight, like a soldier. "Lillian," he began, "I was wrong. I pushed you, and it was selfish. But I don't want you to leave because of me." She looked at him, her gaze icy. "I'm not leaving because of you," she said. "Because of myself. I can't stay here and feel." "Feel what?" He stepped closer. She pressed her lips together, but the silence didn't last long. "You," she exhaled, her voice breaking, "and I hate myself for it." She turned and left, leaving him stunned. She felt something. It was a confession he hadn't expected, and it changed everything. Lillian locked herself in her room, shaking. She'd said it. Again. And now he knew everything. Her tears were a betrayal. Her armor had crumbled, and she hated herself for it. She sat on the floor, hugged her knees, and let the sobs come. She felt him, his strength, his pain, his desire. And she wanted him, not as her boss, not as a savior, but as a person. But it was impossible. She stood, washed her face with cold water, and looked at her packed bag. 3 days. She had to hold on for 3 days. She opened her laptop, checked her email. A confirmation from the new job had arrived. Everything was set, but her heart wasn't ready. She closed her eyes and saw him, standing in the library, eyes full of despair, and her chest tightened, Later, she went to the pantry for cleaning supplies. The door closed behind her, and she heard footsteps. Turning, she saw Edward. He stood in the doorway, blocking the exit, his face tense. "Lillian," he said quietly, "I have to ask, just once." She gripped a bottle tightly, her heart racing. "What?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "If it weren't for your family, your debts, would you stay?" His voice was low, almost pleading. She froze. The question struck at her core. She lowered her eyes, feeling tears burn her lids. "I don't know," she whispered finally. "But it doesn't matter. The debts are there. The family is there." He stepped closer, and she backed up against the shelves. "What if I could take that away?" he asked. "Not as a deal, as a gift." She shook her head, her voice firming. "I won't accept it," she said. "I don't want to owe you. Ever." He nodded, his face darkening. "I understand," he said, "but I won't stop wanting you to stay." She pushed past him, feeling the warmth of his body, and ran out. Edward stayed in the pantry, feeling something inside him die. She was right. He had to let her go, but he didn't know how. The next day, James brought a dossier. Edward opened the folder. Lillian Marsh, 32. Mother with diabetes, stable but expensive treatment. Brother in college, graduating in a year. She was the sole breadwinner. New job in Evanston, lower pay but closer to family. She'd also sent resumes to 2 downtown hotels, but no responses yet. Edward closed the folder, feeling a stab of shame. He'd invaded her life, but now he knew what held her, what made her run, and he could use it. He called her to his office. She entered, holding a tray with coffee, her usual morning routine. "Lillian," he said, "I know about your family. I can help. Pay off the debts, cover your brother's tuition. You wouldn't have to leave." She froze, her face paling. "You dug into my life?" she asked quietly, but there was anger in her voice. "Yes," he admitted, "because I don't want to lose you." She set the tray on the table, her hands trembling. "You had no right," she said. "This is my life, my struggle, and I won't take your charity." She left, slamming the door. Edward stared at the coffee, feeling his plan crumble. He'd wanted to help, but he'd made it worse. Now she hated him even more. Lillian sat in her room, clutching her phone. She shook with rage. He knew. He'd pried into her soul like an open book, and it was humiliating. She hated him for it. But deep down, she felt something else, a warmth from his offer to help. And that was worse. She opened her laptop and emailed the agency, asking them to speed up the job search. She needed to leave. Now. But as she fell asleep, she saw his face, guilty, broken, and her armor cracked more than ever. Edward stood at the window, looking at the city. He'd lost her. His attempt to help had backfired. She was right. He had no right. But he couldn't let go. Not now, when he knew she felt something. He had to find another way, or let her go forever. Lillian sat on the edge of her bed, staring at her phone screen. The agency responded, "A new job as a maid in a private home in Evanston, a Chicago suburb, starting in 5 days." The pay was lower than Edward's, but enough to cover her family's needs. It was an escape. Her 2 weeks at the penthouse could be cut to 4 days if he accepted her request to leave early. She wrote a new resignation, more urgent. "I request to be relieved of my duties, effective April 8, 2025, and left it on the table. Her hands shook, but she forced herself to breathe steadily. This was right. This was necessary. But inside, everything screamed. His face, guilty, broken after she left his office yesterday, wouldn't leave her mind. His words, "I don't want to lose you," echoed, piercing her defenses. She hated him for digging into her life, for offering help, for making her feel. But more, she hated herself, for wanting to accept that help, to stay, to give in. She gripped her phone so tightly her fingers whitened, then threw it on the bed. She had to hold on. She stood, walked to the window, and looked at the city. Morning light bathed Chicago, reflecting off the skyscrapers, but her world stayed in shadow. 4 days. She had to last 4 days. She clenched her fists, reminding herself she wasn't weak. She'd survived too much, a hungry childhood, her father's death, endless medical bills for her mother. Edward Crawford wouldn't break her, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw him, tall, in a sharp suit, eyes full of pain and desire, and it tore her apart. Edward stood in his office, staring at an empty desk. Since her exit yesterday, he couldn't focus on anything. Her anger, "You had no right," was justified. He'd invaded her life, and it was a mistake. But he couldn't stop himself. Knowing about her debts, her family, her struggles, was the only way to understand what kept her here, what made her run. He'd wanted to help, but instead, he'd pushed her further away. Now she despised him, and he deserved it. He walked to the cabinet, grabbed the bourbon, and poured a glass. It was still morning, but he didn't care. He drank, feeling the burn in his throat, but it didn't dull the emptiness. She was leaving, and he didn't know how to stop her. His power, his money, his will, all useless against her stubbornness. For the first time, he felt powerless, and it drove him mad. He remembered her confession. "I hate myself for it." She felt something for him. It was more than he'd hoped, but it didn't change her decision. She chose her independence, her armor, over him, and he couldn't blame her. But he couldn't let go either. He clenched the glass so hard it nearly cracked. He had to find a way, not with force, not with manipulation, something real. But what could he offer? Himself? He didn't know who he was without his empire. The door opened and Lillian entered with a tray. Coffee, as always. But her face was tense, eyes downcast. She set the cup on the table and handed him another sheet of paper. "Mr. Crawford," she said quietly, "I'm asking to shorten the notice period to 4 days. I have another job." Edward took the paper, feeling his heart constrict. 4 days. Her voice was steady, but there was a faint note in it. Fear? Pain? He wasn't sure. "Why so soon?" he asked, looking at her. "Because I can't stay here," she answered, meeting his gaze. "You know why." "Because of me," he said, not as a question, but a statement. She nodded, her lips pressed into a thin line. "I don't want to hate you," she whispered, "but you're making it hard." He stepped closer, and for the first time, she didn't back away. "I don't want you to leave, Lillian," he said quietly. "Not because of money, not because of work, because of you." Her breath hitched, but she held his gaze. "That doesn't change anything," she said. "I'm leaving." She turned and left, leaving him with the paper in his hand. Edward stared at it, feeling something inside him shatter. 4 days. He had 4 days to find a way, or let her go forever. Lillian returned to her room, closed the door, and leaned against it. Her heart raced. His words, "because of you," hit like a punch to the gut. He wasn't talking about debts or offers of money. He was talking about her. And that was worse, because she believed him, believed he felt something real. And that made her decision agonizing. She sat on the bed, pulled out her phone, and texted her mother. "Starting a new job soon. Everything will be fine." It was a lie. Nothing was fine. She felt like a traitor, not to him, but to herself. Her armor, her pride, her independence, all cracking under his gaze, his voice. She hated him for it, and herself for not being able to leave without pain. She stood, walked to the closet, and started packing. 4 days wasn't much, but enough to keep herself together. She folded her uniform, a few dresses, the old family photo, her mother, brother, and her, smiling on a rare happy day. Her life fit into one bag, and that reminded her who she was, not part of his world, but a woman who survived on her own. But as she zipped the bag, her hands trembled. She imagined walking out, him watching her go, and a lump formed in her throat. Why was this so hard? She clenched her fists and reminded herself, this was her choice, her strength. Later, she went to the pantry for cleaning supplies. The door closed behind her, and she heard footsteps. Turning, she saw Edward. He stood in the doorway, blocking the exit, his face tense. "Lillian," he said quietly, "I have to ask, just once." She gripped the bottle tightly, her heart pounding. "What?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "If it weren't for your family, your debts, would you stay?" His voice was low, almost pleading. She froze. The question struck at her core. She lowered her eyes, feeling tears burn her lids. "I don't know," she whispered finally. "But it doesn't matter. The debts are there. The family is there." He stepped closer, and she backed up against the shelves. "What if I could take that away?" he asked. "Not as a deal, as a gift." She shook her head, her voice firming. "I won't accept it," she said. "I don't want to owe you. Ever." He nodded, his face darkening. "I understand," he said, "but I won't stop wanting you to stay." She pushed past him, feeling the warmth of his body, and ran out. Edward stayed in the pantry, feeling something inside him die. She was right. He had to let her go, but he didn't know how. The next day, James brought more details. Edward opened the folder. Her mother was in the hospital, condition stable but costly. Her brother would graduate college in a year. She was the only provider. The new job in Evanston paid less, but was closer to family. She'd also applied to 2 downtown hotels, but no responses yet. Edward closed the folder, feeling a stab of shame. He shouldn't have pried, but he couldn't stop. He called her to the living room that evening. She entered, standing straight. "Lillian," he began, "I won't stop you, but I have to say something." She froze, not turning around. "Say it," she replied, her voice even but tense. "I've never met anyone like you," he started. "You're stronger than I am, and I admire you, but I can't stop wanting you near." She turned, her eyes glistening in the dim light. "That doesn't change anything," she said. "You know why I'm leaving." "I know," he stepped closer, "but I have to try, just once. Tell me you feel nothing, and I'll let you go right now." Her breath hitched. She looked at him, a storm in her eyes, anger, fear, something else. "I feel something," she whispered finally, "and it's killing me." She turned away, but he caught the tears on her lashes. He stepped closer, placed a hand on her shoulder. She tensed, but didn't pull away. "Lillian," he said quietly, "I don't want to break you. I want—" "What?" She turned sharply, brushing his hand away. "What do you want? For me to throw everything away for you? For what?" "For us," he said, his voice trembling. "I don't know what that means, but I know I don't want to lose you." She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "There is no us," she said. "There's you, and there's me, and nothing can be between us." She left, leaving him in silence. Edward stared at the empty room, his heart tightening. She was right. But her tears, her words, "It's killing me." said more than she intended. She felt something, and that gave him hope he didn't deserve. Lillian locked herself in her room, shaking. She'd said it. Again. And now he knew everything. Her tears were a betrayal. Her armor had crumbled, and she hated herself for it. She sat on the floor, hugged her knees, and let the sobs come. She felt him, his strength, his pain, his desire, and she wanted him, not as her boss, not as a savior, but as a person. But it was impossible. She stood, washed her face, and looked at her bag. 3 days. She had to hold on for 3 days. She checked her email, a confirmation from the new job. Everything was set, but her heart wasn't. She closed her eyes and saw him, standing in the library, eyes full of despair, and her chest tightened. Later, she went to the kitchen to prepare dinner, her last duty of the day. Edward entered as she chopped vegetables. He stopped at the door, watching her. "Lillian," he said, "I won't push anymore, but I need to know. If things were different, would you give me a chance?" She froze, the knife in her hand trembling. "I don't know," she said quietly, "and I don't want to know, because it doesn't matter." He nodded, his face weary. "I understand," he said, "but I'll always regret it." He left, leaving her alone. Lillian stared at the knife, feeling tears burn her eyes again. He was giving up, and that hurt more than his fight. Edward couldn't sleep. Her tears, her voice, it all spun in his head. She felt something, but she was leaving. He sat in his office, staring at her resignation. 3 days. He could fight, but it would break her, and he didn't want that. For the first time, he realized his desire wasn't the most important thing. Her freedom, her strength, that's what he respected and loved. He picked up a pen and signed her resignation. Then he called James. "Transfer $50,000 to her mother's account," he said, anonymously, no trace. James nodded. "That's all?" "No." Edward stood. "Draft a letter. I want her to know I'm letting her go, but not today, when she leaves." He walked to the window, looking at the city. He'd let her go, but he wouldn't forget. The next day, Lillian was cleaning the living room when he entered. She froze, but he didn't approach. "Lillian," he said, "I signed your resignation. You're free in 3 days." She looked at him, her eyes dry but tired. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded. "I won't bother you anymore," he said. "But know this, you changed me." He left, leaving her in silence. Lillian watched him go, feeling something inside her break. He'd let her go, and it hurt more than she expected. Lillian woke at dawn, a weight in her chest. Today was her last day at the penthouse. Her bag stood by the door, packed and ready. Uniform, a few dresses, the family photo. Her life, compressed into one small suitcase. She got up, splashed cold water on her face, and looked in the mirror. Her face was pale, eyes exhausted, but determined. 3 days ago, Edward had signed her resignation, and since then, he'd kept his word. No seeking her out, no talking, no looking. His absence felt like a void, but she knew it was better this way. This was her choice. She put on her uniform for the last time, smoothed her apron, and stepped into the hall. The penthouse was quiet, as always, but today the silence felt heavier. Her shift ended at noon, and she'd be gone. The new job in Evanston waited tomorrow. She reminded herself, this was progress. For her family, for herself. But each step on the marble floor echoed with pain in her chest. She didn't want to admit she was leaving more behind than just a job. She started with the kitchen, wiped the counters, cleaned the coffee maker, put away dishes. Her movements were precise but slow, as if she were stalling. She hated herself for it. She needed to leave quickly without looking back. But part of her, the part she tried to suppress, wanted to see him one last time. Just see him. She pressed her lips together and kept working. Edward stood at the office window, looking at the city. The morning was clear, Chicago sparkling under the sun, but his world remained gray. Today, she'd leave. He'd signed her resignation 3 days ago and kept his distance since. It was what she wanted, and he respected it. But every day without her felt like a knife to the chest. He was used to her footsteps, her presence, her quiet strength. Now, that was slipping away, and he didn't know how to fill the void. He hadn't slept last night. He'd sat in his office, drank bourbon, and stared at the letter he'd written for her. Simple words, no manipulation, no pleas. Lillian, I'm letting you go. You changed me more than I can say. Be happy. Edward. He'd given it to James with instructions to deliver it after she left. It was all he could do. He couldn't stop her, couldn't break her will, but he could let her know what she meant to him. He heard footsteps in the hall, light, familiar. She was in the kitchen. He clenched his fist, fighting the urge to go there. He'd promised not to disturb her, but the thought that this might be the last time he'd see her was unbearable. He walked to the door, cracked it open, and froze. She stood at the counter, wiping it with the same precision as always. Her hair, pulled back in a bun, gleamed in the morning light. Her face was tense, but beautiful, even in exhaustion, even in pain. He closed the door and returned to the window. He wouldn't go. This was her day, her freedom. Lillian finished the kitchen and moved to the living room. She was wiping the glass table when she heard footsteps. Her heart tightened, but she didn't turn. It could be anyone. Another staff member, James. But she knew it was him. She felt his presence like warmth on her skin. The steps stopped at the door, and she froze, cloth in hand. Lillian. His voice was low, soft. She turned slowly. Edward stood in the doorway in a dark gray suit, hands in his pockets. His face was weary, eyes deep with something she didn't want to name. I thought you'd already left, he said, though both knew it was a lie. My shift ends at noon, she replied, trying to keep her voice steady. He nodded, stepped closer. I didn't want to disturb you, he said, but I couldn't not say goodbye. Her throat tightened. She lowered her eyes, feeling tears burn her lids. Thank you, she whispered, for everything. He looked at her, pain in his gaze. I should be thanking you, he said. You showed me I'm not as strong as I thought. She met his eyes, holding his gaze. For the first time in days, he was this close, and she felt the heat of his body, the scent of his cologne. Her armor cracked, but she held firm. You're stronger than you think, she said quietly. Just not with me. He pressed his lips together, nodded. Maybe, he said, but I'll miss you, Lillian, more than I can say. She turned away, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't want to hear this, didn't want to feel. But she did. His pain, his sincerity, his loss, and hers. Goodbye, Mr. Crawford, she said, not turning back, and left the room. Edward watched her go, feeling something inside him die. Her words, goodbye, were the final period. He didn't stop her. He couldn't. He returned to his office, sat at his desk, and poured bourbon. The glass trembled in his hand. She was gone, and he'd let her go. But the emptiness she left was bigger than he'd expected. He opened a drawer and pulled out her first resignation, the one with 2 weeks' notice. He'd kept it like a talisman all these days. Now it was useless. He crumpled it in his fist and threw it in the trash. This was the end. But her face, her voice, her strength, those would stay with him forever. James entered an hour later. "She's gone," he said. "I delivered the letter as you asked." Edward nodded, not looking up. "Thanks," he said, "and make sure the transfer to her mother's account went through." James nodded and left. Edward stood, walked to the window, and looked at the city. She was out there somewhere, free. He hoped she'd be happy, even if it meant he'd never see her again. Lillian stepped out of the elevator, bag in hand. The penthouse lobby was behind her, and she stepped onto the street. A spring wind hit her face, cold and sharp. She stopped, looked at Chicago, the city that was her home, her struggle, her pain. She gripped the bag handle and headed for the subway. Her new life started tomorrow, but today, all she felt was loss. On the subway, she sat by the window, watching the lights blur by. Her thoughts returned to him, his final words, his eyes. She hated herself for it. She'd made her choice. She was free. So why did it hurt so much? When she reached Logan Square, her phone buzzed. A message from her mother. "Lily, $50,000 just hit the account, anonymously. Do you know who it is?" Lillian froze. She knew. It was him. Even after letting her go, he couldn't help but help. She gripped her phone, tears streaming down her cheeks. She didn't want this, but she couldn't return the money. It was his goodbye. At home, she dropped her bag on the floor and sat on the couch. Her hands shook. She pulled a folded paper from her pocket, the letter James had handed her at the exit. She hadn't wanted to open it, but her fingers unfolded it anyway. "Lillian, I'm letting you go. You changed me more than I can say. Be happy." Edward's simple words, but they hit her heart like a hammer. She clutched the letter and cried, quietly, soundlessly. She'd made her choice. She'd kept herself intact. But part of her stayed there, in the penthouse, with him. A week passed. Lillian started her new job in Evanston. The house was smaller, the employers, an elderly couple, kind but demanding. She performed her duties with the same precision as always, but her mind was elsewhere. She couldn't forget him, his voice, his gaze, his letter. She kept it in her desk drawer, a secret she couldn't let go. Her mother called every day, thrilled about the money, making plans. Her brother texted that he'd finish college debt-free. Lillian smiled for them, but inside, there was a void. She'd chosen this for them, but she'd lost something of herself. One evening, she stood at the window, looking at the suburban lights. Her hand clutched the letter in her pocket. She could call him, find him, but she wouldn't. Her independence, her principles, were more important. She'd let him go, as he'd let her go. But forgetting was different. Edward sat in his office, looking at the city. A week without her felt like forever. He'd hired a new maid, young, quiet, flawless. But she wasn't Lillian. No one was. He worked, drank, lived, but it was all mechanical. Her absence was a shadow he couldn't shake. He opened a drawer and pulled out her old uniform, the one she'd left in the laundry. He didn't know why he'd kept it, maybe as a reminder. He ran his fingers over the fabric, feeling a pang of pain. She was gone, and he'd let her go, but he couldn't let her go from his soul. He stood, walked to the window, and looked at Chicago. She was out there, living her life. He hoped she was happy. He'd done all he could, given her freedom, given her help, given her goodbye. But he couldn't give her himself, because she wouldn't have taken it. He poured bourbon, raised the glass, and whispered, "To you, Lillian," and drank as silence filled his life. Subscribe to our channel if you want more of these exciting stories. We will be incredibly glad to see you among our viewers and look forward to sharing with you new emotions, dramatic plots, and inspiring moments that will touch your hearts and will not leave you indifferent. Join our friendly audience to immerse yourself in the world of deep human feelings, unexpected twists of fate, and stories that make you think and worry. Your support is very important to us, and we promise that each new video will bring you joy, excitement, and lots of impressions. Let's create something special together.